Do you fear your voice is just static in a deafening world? That your pain is invisible to those you love? This journey reveals the terrifying price of being truly heard, transforming agony into the only melody that matters. The silence wasn't empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that Maximilian Crane clawed at every waking second. In the hollowed-out chest of a derelict Cadillac plant in Detroit, the air tasted of ozone and dried copper. He didn't need ears to know the city outside was screaming. He needed the resonance. He stood over a man strapped to a rusted assembly rack, a drifter whose name had been erased by the streets. Max's hands, once capable of coaxing tears from a Stradivarius, now held a spool of surgical-grade steel wire. The man's mouth was a silent O, his vocal cords already severed to ensure no vulgar screams polluted the purity of the vibration. Max wasn't killing him. He was tuning him. He felt the ghost of a rhythm in his fingertips, a phantom pulse that replaced the music the world had stolen from him in a tangle of car metal and broken glass. The first incision was a stroke of genius. Max threaded the wire through the bicep, bypassing the bone to graze the radial nerve with the precision of a master luthier. He watched the man's body jerk a sharp, staccato movement. C-sharp, Max thought, his fingers resting lightly on the wire to catch the hum. To anyone else, it was a gruesome torture. To Max, it was the first note of a symphony the London Philharmonic was too cowardly to play. He moved with a frantic, rhythmic grace, his pale, translucent skin glistening under the flicker of dying fluorescent tubes. Every twitch of the victim's muscle was a frequency, a raw data point of human agony that bypassed the flawed medium of air and spoke directly to the soul through the floorboards. He was building a bridge to the pure music, a realm where sound was felt in the marrow rather than heard in the ear. "Do you feel it?" Max whispered into the man's unhearing ear, his own voice a phantom limb he could no longer perceive. He adjusted a copper dial on a massive jury-rigged amplifier salvaged from the ruins of the 1980s. The needle jumped. The vibration traveled up the wire, through the man's nervous system, and back into the sensors. A low, guttural thrum began to shake the very foundations of the factory. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was a sound that rearranged your DNA. The victim's eyes rolled back, not in death, but in the overwhelming sensory overload of becoming a literal circuit. This was the breakthrough. The man on the rack was no longer a person. He was a bridge between the physical world and the divine mathematics of pain, a living cello of meat and wire. The urgency clawed at Max's insides like a starving beast. The silence concert was only weeks away, and the ensemble was incomplete. He needed more strings. He looked at the map of Detroit pinned to the wall, marked with the haunts of the forgotten alleys, shelters, and bridge underpasses. Each red pin was a potential note, a hidden resonance waiting to be tapped. He felt the phantom itch of his lost hearing, the agonizing memory of the applause he once received. But as the floor vibrated with the rhythmic spasms of his instrument, Max smiled. It was a jagged, terrifying expression. The world had turned its back on his genius, so he would make the world vibrate until its teeth shattered. The symphony was beginning, and the first movement required a sacrifice that Detroit wouldn't even notice until the music became too loud to ignore. The damp, metallic rot of the Detroit factory breathed with a rhythm that only Maximilian Max Crane could perceive, a subsonic thrumming that bypassed his shattered eardrums and vibrated directly into the plates of his skull. Within the studio of eternity, the impasse had become a physical weight. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, oxidized copper, and the copper-sweet tang of blood that refused to dry. Max stood over a sprawling console of salvaged analog gear, his fingers long, skeletal, and trembling with a cocktail of exhaustion and neurological fire. Fumbled with a series of silver-plated electrodes. He was losing the frequency. The three instruments, currently suspended from the rusted I-beam's former dockworkers, whose names had been erased by the necessity of the art, were failing to sustain the resonance. Their nervous systems were fraying under the constant electrical stimulation, the pure music becoming a muddy, discordant cacophony of dying pulses. He couldn't fix the biological degradation. The human body was a fragile vessel, and his current subjects were leaking the very energy he needed to capture. The police were a distant thought, a nuisance of the mundane world. But the real threat was the silence returning to claim him before the symphony was complete. He screamed into the void of his own head, a soundless howl that tore at his throat, as he watched the needles on the VU meters drop into the red, signaling the impending expiration of his most resonant tenor. Every attempt to recalibrate the strings, the ultra-fine steel wires threaded through the victim's brachial plexuses, only resulted in more anatomical failure. Max paced the perimeter of the stage, his heavy leather apron clicking against his black wool trousers, his mind a whirlwind of frantic calculations. He had reached a technical stalemate. To increase the volume of the vibration, he needed higher voltage, but higher voltage cooked the nerves, silencing the instrument forever. He looked at his own hands, the skin so translucent he could see the sluggish pulse in his veins, and felt a surge of loathing for the biological limitations of his medium. He had sacrificed his career, his reputation, and his very country to find this sound. Yet here in the guts of a dead city, he was being thwarted by the simple mortality of flesh. He tried to recall the sound of a Stradivarius, the way the wood hummed against his chin at the London Philharmonic, but the memory was a ghost, a flickering shadow that provided no warmth. The impasse was not just technical, it was existential. If he could not bridge the gap between the physical scream and the divine frequency, he was nothing more than a butcher in a tuxedo, a thought that made his ice-blue eyes burn with a terrifying manic light. Among the suspended figures was Elias, a man Max had once seen playing a battered cello on a subway platform. Elias was the cello of this macabre ensemble, his muscular frame now a map of silver wire and surgical staples. The stakes were no longer just about the music. They were about the legacy of the pain Max felt every second of his silent life. He leaned in close to Elias, whose eyes were wide, fixed in a permanent stare of neurological overload, his vocal cords long ago severed to ensure the silence of the performance. Max adjusted a tension screw embedded in Elias's shoulder blade, and for a moment, a pure crystalline note vibrated through the floorboards, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. But then, the smell of burning hair filled the air, and the note dissolved into a wet, sickening thud. The wire had snapped through the muscle. Max collapsed against a stack of amplifiers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't go back, and he couldn't move forward with these low-quality materials. The local shelters were empty, the streets were becoming wary, and the silence concert was a looming specter on the calendar of his mind. He was a conductor without a reliable orchestra, a god whose creations were too weak to survive his touch. In the guttering light of the fluorescent tubes, Max realized the fundamental flaw in his design: the distance. The separation between the conductor and the instrument created a loss of signal, a dampening of the raw, emotional data. He walked to a cracked mirror bolted to a support pillar, staring at the gaunt, skeletal reflection of a man who had become a ghost before his death. He touched the sharp bridge of his nose, then traced the line down to his thin, pale lips, which were pulled back in a grimace of sudden, violent inspiration. The impasse wouldn't be solved by more victims. It would be solved by integration. He needed a central nervous system that could act as a bridge, a primary conductor to regulate the flow of agony and transform it into the perfect note. He looked at the heavy gauge wires hanging from the ceiling, then at his own spine. The cliffhanger of his existence teetered on the edge of a jagged blade. To finish the symphony, he would have to become the very thing he played. He reached for a surgical drill, the bit glinting under the flickering lights, and as the first siren wailed in the distance, a sound he couldn't hear but felt as a prickle on his skin. He pressed the cold steel against his own vertebrae, ready to wire himself into the heart of the machine. The cold steel of the surgical bit didn't just touch his skin, it claimed it, a metallic parasite seeking the marrow of a genius. Maximilian Crane, gaunt, skeletal, and vibrating with a frequency no living man was meant to inhabit, felt the hum of the factory floor through the soles of his boots, a low-frequency moan that synchronized with the throb in his temples. He was a 6'2" ghost in a tattered white tuxedo shirt, his jet-black hair slicked back like a funeral director's, staring into a cracked mirror that reflected a man who had traded his soul for a phantom sound. The air in the Detroit warehouse tasted of iron and ancient grease, a stagnant soup of industrial decay that clung to his translucent, sickly skin. Just as the drill's tip bit into the dermis above his third vertebrae, a sound, not a vibration, but a physical pressure against the door shattered his concentration. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway, a silhouette of London's high society draped in a cashmere overcoat that looked like a shroud in this tomb of steel. Elias, who had once shared a music stand with Max at the Philharmonic, didn't scream. He simply exhaled a name that sounded like a prayer for the dead. Maximilian. Max didn't turn his head, but his piercing ice-blue eyes, sunken deep within their orbits, caught Elias's reflection, his thin, pale lips curling into a grimace that was more a snarl of artistic possessiveness than a greeting. "You're late for the rehearsal, Elias." Max's voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dead leaves skittering across a stone floor, stripped of its British lilt and replaced by something hollow and percussive. He didn't drop the drill. He held it like a conductor's baton, the heavy leather apron he wore stained with the dark, copper-scented oil of human and machine creaking, as he finally turned to face his intruder. Elias took a step forward, his eyes darting from the wires snaking across the ceiling to the instruments suspended in the shadows, the living, breathing meat that Max had tuned to a divine pitch. "They told me you were dead, or worse, insane," Elias whispered, his voice trembling as he took in Max's gaunt frame, the visible veins beneath his translucent skin pulsing like blue worms. "I see now they were optimists. This isn't music, Max. This is a slaughterhouse." Max's aquiline nose flared, the sharp bridge of it catching the flickering fluorescent light as he stepped toward his former friend with a wiry, predatory strength. "Music is the movement of particles, Elias. It is the agitation of the soul through the medium of the physical. You played for the ears, those fragile, failing membranes that betrayed me, but I play for the nerves themselves. I am translating the scream of the universe into a language the body cannot ignore. You call it slaughter, but look at them. They are no longer beggars. They are the strings of a god's lyre." Max gestured wildly to the darkness behind him, where a row of 10 bodies hung like macabre cocoons, their vocal cords severed, their skin a map of silver wires and tension. Each victim was a note in his unfinished symphony, their muscles twitching in a rhythmic, agonizing staccato that Max felt as a delicious itch behind his eyes. The London Philharmonic was a cage of wood and horsehair, Elias. We were museum curators, dusting off the corpses of Mozart and Beethoven. Here, in the rot of Detroit, I have found the raw material of the future. He moved closer, the smell of his own unwashed, greasy hair and the metallic tang of the apron filling the space between them. Elias recoiled, his back hitting a support pillar, his gaze fixed on Max's thin, pale lips as they formed the words of his damnation. "I need a primary conductor, Elias. Someone who understands the mathematics of a crescendo. My own spine is ready. The holes are drilled. The interface is waiting. But the system lacks a bridge, a conscious mind that can filter the cacophony into a singular, shattering beauty." Max's ice-blue eyes burned with a terrifying, lucid fever, his skeletal hand reaching out to touch Elias's throat, his fingers feeling the vibration of the other man's pulse, a tempo he found tragically, insultingly common. The confrontation reached its breaking point as Max's wiry grip tightened, not out of malice, but out of a desperate artistic necessity that saw Elias not as a man, but as a missing frequency. Don't you want to hear it? The note that ends all notes? The sound of the soul leaving the vessel? Elias tried to speak, to plead, but the words were lost as Max shoved him toward the massive amplification system, the wires hissing like vipers as they were dragged across the concrete. The silence concert was no longer a future event. It was beginning now, in this moment of rupture, as Max realized that his former colleague's terror provided a resonance far superior to the dull agony of the homeless. With a swift, practiced motion, Max pinned Elias against the control board, the electronics humming with a hungry, expectant glow. He picked up a length of the ultra-fine steel wire, its edge sharp enough to slice through thought itself, and held it up to the light. "Listen with your marrow, Elias," Max hissed, his thin bridge of a nose inches from the other man's face, his slicked-back hair falling in a single greasy strand over his forehead. As the first siren from a passing patrol car wailed in the distance, a sound Max only knew as a violent ripple in the air. He pressed the wire against Elias's collarbone, the first stitch in a masterpiece that would require every drop of their shared history to complete. The drill whirred back to life, a high-pitched scream that signaled the end of the man and the birth of the instrument, leaving the warehouse in a state of horrific, vibrating anticipation. The drill bit didn't just pierce skin, it sought the frequency of the soul. Maximilian "Max" Crane worked with a surgeon's precision and a butcher's indifference, his skeletal fingers dancing over the chrome interface as he threaded the ultra-fine steel wires through Elias's brachial plexus. Each involuntary twitch from the former cellist was a metric, a data point in a grander design of neurological resonance. Max's heavy leather apron, stained with the oxidized legacy of previous instruments and the grime of the Detroit warehouse, creaked as he leaned in, his piercing ice-blue eyes reflecting the cold, fluorescent flicker of the factory lights. He wasn't looking at a former friend. He was tuning a cello made of living pulse and raw terror. The air in the Froom of eternity was thick with the smell of ozone, copper, and damp concrete, a metallic perfume that heralded the birth of a new artistic era. As the wires tightened, pulling Elias's limbs into the geometric web of metal that dominated the industrial floor, Max felt the first true resonance, a low-frequency thrum that bypassed his dead eardrums and vibrated directly into his marrow, a sensation more intimate than any sound he had ever known. The warehouse was a cathedral of rot, a monument to a city that had forgotten how to dream, now repurposed for a nightmare of exquisite, vibrating clarity. Massive amplification stacks, salvaged from the ruins of old theaters and industrial PA systems, loomed like obsidian monoliths against the cracked, soot-stained walls. Max moved between them like a ghost, his gaunt, 6'2" frame casting long, jagged shadows across the 10 other instruments, already suspended in the loom. These were the voiceless, the forgotten of the streets, their vocal cords surgically severed to ensure that no mundane scream could pollute the purity of the nervous system's vibration. They hung like marionettes of meat, intertwined by thousands of silver threads that caught the moonlight filtering through the shattered skylights above. Max's tattered white tuxedo shirt, damp with sweat and stained with industrial lubricants, clung to his skeletal ribs as he adjusted the tension on a wire connected to a woman's femur. He could feel the music building, not as an audible melody, but as a crushing pressure in the atmosphere, a gathering storm of biological electricity waiting for the conductor's spark. When the heavy iron doors finally groaned open, the audience stepped out of the shadows, a cabal of the jaded and the depraved, dressed in silks and furs that looked obscene against the industrial grime. These were the New York extremists, seekers of the forbidden, who had paid fortunes to witness the symphony of the nerves. Max didn't greet them with words. He simply stood center stage, a skeletal apparition in a rust-stained apron, his jet-black hair slicked back into a greasy helmet that emphasized the hollows of his sunken orbits. He watched them through the prism of his own feverish madness, seeing them not as people, but as witnesses to the only truth that mattered. That pain is the only universal language. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to warp the very light. Max stepped toward the master control board, his thin, pale lips pressed into a line of grim resolve. He could see the fear reflecting in the eyes of his guests, a delicious, high-pitched vibration that added a shimmering layer of dissonance to the ambient hum of the machinery. The stage was set. The living instruments were tuned to the frequency of absolute agony, and the world was about to learn that the void had a voice. The first impulse was a spark of pure, unadulterated lightning. Max threw the primary switch, sending a surge of low-voltage electricity directly into the neural pathways of the suspended victims. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The web didn't just move. It convulsed in a synchronized, violent spasm that defied human anatomy. The massive speakers didn't emit a scream, but a sound that resembled the grinding of tectonic plates mixed with the shimmering glass of 1,000 broken hearts. It was a sonorous, crystalline groan that vibrated the floorboards and made the audience's teeth ache with sympathetic resonance. Max stood in the center of the cacophony. His eyes rolled back, his hands clawing at the air as if he could touch the invisible waves of agony. But even as the symphony reached its first crescendo, a look of profound disappointment flickered across his gaunt features. It was beautiful, but it was still external. He was the conductor, but he was not yet the music. He looked down at his own trembling hands, then at the empty ports on the control board, designed for the ultimate connection. The realization hit him like a physical blow. To achieve the perfect note, the observer must become the observed, and the creator must be consumed by his own creation. The final movement of the symphony required the one sacrifice he had held back: his own spinal cord. The air in the chamber of eternity had become a thick, gelatinous soup of ozone, copper, and the unspoken screams of the 10 living marionettes suspended above the stage. Maximilian "Max" Crane stood amidst the oscillating hum of the amplifiers, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that rattled against his sunken ribs. The sound produced by the victims, a crystalline, subterranean vibration that hummed through the marrow of everyone present, was exquisite, yet it remained frustratingly external to him. He watched the way the steel wires, thinner than a human hair, vibrated within the exposed muscle tissue of a former drifter, turning biological agony into a sonorous, haunting, cello-like moan. But to Max, this was merely a rehearsal. The ice blue of his eyes, buried deep within their skeletal orbits, flickered with a manic clarity as he realized the fatal flaw in his design. He was still the observer, a ghost haunting the periphery of his own masterpiece. The radical art seekers from New York sat in the shadows, their faces pale masks of voyeuristic terror. But Max no longer cared for their approval. He was chasing a frequency that existed only in the white-hot center of self-annihilation, a note so pure it would shatter the boundary between the conductor and the symphony. With a deliberate, terrifying grace, Max began to shed the remnants of his former life. He peeled back the sleeves of his stained white tuxedo shirt, revealing arms that looked like bundles of dry kindling wrapped in translucent parchment. Every vein was a roadmap of his obsession, pulsing with a rhythmic tremor that matched the low-frequency throb of the industrial generators. He reached for the heavy leather apron, the hide stiff with layers of dried motor oil and oxidized blood, and cinched it tight over his gaunt frame. The weight of it was a comfort, a tactile reminder of the labor required to transcend the flesh. He moved toward the auxiliary rack, where the primary spinal leads lay coiled like silver vipers. These were his masterpieces, microfilaments, tipped with neuroconductive needles designed to bypass the skin and interface directly with the central nervous system. His thin, pale lips curled into a mirthless smile, a jagged line of resolve that signaled the end of his career as a man and the beginning of his existence as an instrument. The audience watched in a suffocating silence as he began to calibrate the input levels, his skeletal fingers dancing over the dials with the same terrifying precision that had once earned him standing ovations at the London Philharmonic. He positioned himself at the center of the stage, directly beneath the apex of the wire web. The victims above him twitched in a synchronized spasm, their cut vocal cords producing only the wet, rhythmic clicking of air through blood. Max didn't look up. He was focused on the silver leads. He took the first needle, a 4-inch spike of surgical steel, and felt for the gap between his third and fourth vertebrae. The pain of the initial puncture was a bright, blinding flash of yellow in his mind, a sharp, staccato note that nearly buckled his knees. But he welcomed it. He pushed the needle deeper, through the muscle, through the dura mater, until he felt the sickening, electric pop as it seated itself against his spinal cord. A jolt of raw voltage screamed through his limbs, causing his jet-black, greasy hair to stand on end and his muscles to lock in a rigid, ectomorphic cramp. He didn't scream. Instead, he gasped, a sound of profound, ecstatic relief. He was no longer hearing the music. He was starting to feel the texture of the sound as it traveled through his own nerves. He reached for the second needle, then the third, his movements becoming more fluid as the adrenaline and the mounting electrical charge turned his wiry strength into something supernatural. By the time the sixth lead was embedded in his spine, Max Crane was a map of silver wires and pulsing light. He stood at the master control board, his body connected to the massive speaker arrays by a dozen umbilical cords of steel. The room began to vibrate with a subharmonic frequency that made the very foundations of the old automobile factory groan in sympathetic resonance. He could feel the heartbeat of every victim in the room, their terror flowing into him like a dark, nourishing river. He looked at the final port on the console, the one labeled Output, Absolute. This was the threshold. To turn that dial was to invite a surge of power that his fragile, skeletal frame could never survive. But it was the only way to achieve the perfect note. The sound of a soul being torn from its moorings. His hand hovered over the switch, his thin bridge of an aquiline nose twitching with the scent of burning insulation and his own singed hair. The ice blue of his eyes had turned almost white as the pupils dilated to the edges of the iris. He looked at the audience, not with malice, but with a terrifying, divine pity. They were about to witness the moment the silence of the universe was finally broken. With a sudden, violent jerk of his head, he slammed the switch into the on position, and the world dissolved into a blinding, sonorous white. The absolute output was not merely a sound, it was a physical erasure of the material world. As Max slammed the switch, the air inside the Detroit factory didn't just vibrate, it curdled, turning into a pressurized soup of kinetic energy. The high-tension steel wires connecting Max's spinal cord to the massive amplifier arrays glowed a dull, necrotic violet as the full, unregulated amperage of the city's neglected power grid surged through his marrow. The audience, those elite, jaded ghouls from the New York underground, didn't even have the chance to applaud or flee. Their eardrums did not just burst, they disintegrated. The delicate hammers, anvils, and stirrups of their inner ears were pulverized by a frequency that bypassed the atmosphere entirely, speaking directly to the calcium of their skulls. Thick, dark blood began to leak from every orifice of the spectators, their eyes bulging as the subharmonic vibrations liquefied their internal organs. Max stood at the epicenter of this hurricane of agony, his 6'2" skeletal frame arching backward with a sickening, audible crunch of vertebrae. His jet-black, greasy hair stood on end, dancing like a halo of dying crows in the static-charged air. He was no longer a man. He was the lightning rod for a symphony of total annihilation, his ice-blue eyes rolling back into his head until only the blinding, ecstatic white of his transcendence remained. The 10 victims, Their vocal cords, long ago severed by Max's surgical precision, finally found a collective voice through the medium of copper and steel. As the electrical surge reached its terminal peak, their muscular structures underwent a final, violent contraction, a rigor mortis induced by pure, unadulterated energy. The wires threaded through their nerves hummed with a sound that was simultaneously celestial and subterranean, a resonance that captured the exact frequency of the soul's friction against the meat of the body. Max felt every pulse, every dying spark of consciousness from the 10 instruments merging with his own nervous system. He was a circuit, a conduit for the ultimate expression of human suffering transformed into art. His pale, translucent skin, mapped with bulging blue veins, began to smoke and char at the entry points of the wires. The scent of ozone, burning tuxedo silk, and singed hair filled the cavernous hall, yet the music, the perfect note, was so beautiful that it seemed to justify the carnage. In that final agonizing crescendo, the boundaries between the bodies dissolved. The steel wires tightened with a mechanical whine, pulling Max from his podium and dragging the victims from their hooks, reeling them all into a singular central mass of pulsating, electrified flesh and steel. When the Detroit Police Department's tactical unit breached the heavy iron doors at dawn, they were met with a silence more terrifying than any scream. The room of eternity had become a tomb of cold iron and scorched earth. The massive speaker arrays had melted into distorted black husks, their cones shredded like dead skin. In the center of the stage stood the Ban Jiao Huang, a towering, grotesque monument of human suffering and engineering that defied medical logic. Max Crane had achieved his masterpiece. His gaunt, ectomorphic body was now inseparable from the 10 victims. Their limbs were woven together by miles of silver wire, creating a complex, geometric spiderweb of gore and precision. His sharp, aquiline nose was tilted upward toward the skylight, and his thin, pale lips were frozen in a terrifyingly serene smile. The wires had fused into the bone, turning the group into a singular metallic organism that looked like a fallen angel caught in a cage of its own making. Detective Miller, a 30-year veteran of the city's most brutal homicides, took one look at the sculpture, turned away, and vomited. The air still tasted of dry electricity and the heavy metallic tang of dried blood. On the far wall, written in a sprawling, elegant script that provided a haunting contrast to the carnage below, was the final movement of Max's score. The words, painted in a mixture of industrial oil and arterial red, shimmered in the weak morning light. Perfect music requires absolute sacrifice. The investigation would consume the department for years, and the conductor of Detroit would become a legend whispered in the darkest corners of the art world. But the sound, the true sound Max had captured, remained trapped within the distorted metal of the sculpture. Some say that on quiet nights, if you stand near the ruins of the old automobile factory, you can still hear it. It isn't a melody, and it isn't a rhythm. It is a vibration felt in the very teeth. A low, haunting thrum of a man who finally found the frequency of the infinite. Maximilian Crane had not simply died. He had translated his existence into a vibration that would never truly stop, marking a new start for a genre of music that no longer required ears to be heard, only a soul to be shattered. The symphony concludes, but the echoes linger forever. Did Max find beauty or just the ultimate madness? Subscribe and like if this finale shook your soul. Comment encore for more dark dramas. Don't miss our next chilling tale today at 2 p.m.